Part 1. What happened to medieval villages after everyone died? Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to a quiet medieval village. So dim the lights. Settle into your blankets. Perhaps put your phone face down somewhere nearby. And together, let's wander down a muddy road that hasn't existed for centuries. A road lined with crooked cottages. A road where smoke no longer rises from the chimneys. A road where the church bell has fallen silent. Because tonight, we're exploring a strangely peaceful question. What happened to medieval villages after everyone died? It sounds like the beginning of a ghost story, but the reality was often stranger. And, in its own quiet way, far sadder. Across medieval Europe, thousands of villages appeared, flourished, and vanished. Some disappeared after plague. Others faded after famine, war, economic collapse, or simply because people decided life somewhere else looked slightly less miserable, which, considering medieval standards, was a fairly low bar. Tonight we'll walk through these abandoned places. We'll meet the people who once lived there. We'll watch their villages empty. And then we'll see what happened. When nature slowly reclaimed everything they left behind. Let's begin. Imagine a small English village around the year 1300. It's early morning. The village consists of perhaps 30 families. A few dozen timber houses stand along a dirt path. Most roofs are made from straw. Most floors are dirt. Most residents are farmers. And most of them are already awake because medieval life had a remarkable tendency to begin before sunrise. The villagers live close together. They share fields. They share tools. They share livestock. And unfortunately, they also share diseases. A great deal of disease. The village church sits at the center of life. The priest knows everybody. Everybody knows everybody else's business. Privacy is largely theoretical. The average person rarely travels farther than a few miles from home. For many villagers, the entire world consists of fields, forests, neighboring settlements, and perhaps one market town. Life is difficult, but it is familiar. The seasons pass. Children are born. Crops grow. Taxes arrive. Taxes continue arriving. And then, just when everyone thinks they understand how life works, disaster appears. Sometimes disaster arrived on horseback. Sometimes it arrived with an army. Sometimes it arrived inside a rat-infested cart. And sometimes it arrived because the weather simply decided to become terrible. The medieval world was surprisingly creative when inventing ways to ruin someone's year. Let's drift first toward the most famous catastrophe, the Black Death. By the time plague reached Europe in the 1340s, nobody understood germs. Nobody knew about bacteria. Nobody knew why people suddenly became sick. One day a person felt healthy. A few days later they were dead. Naturally, people developed explanations. Perhaps the stars were angry. Perhaps God was angry. Perhaps foreign travelers were responsible. Perhaps witches. Medieval society was often very enthusiastic about finding somebody to blame. The actual culprit, of course, was a bacterium carried by fleas. Not quite as dramatic as angry planets, but considerably more effective. When plague entered a village, everything changed. The first deaths might seem unusual, then alarming, then overwhelming. Entire households disappeared. Parents died. Children died. Priests died. Blacksmiths died. The people responsible for burying the dead sometimes died before finishing the job. In many places, mortality rates reached astonishing levels. Some communities lost half their population. Others lost even more. A village that once contained 200 residents might suddenly contain 50, or 20, or none at all. And that's where our story begins. Because once the survivors left or died, the village itself entered a strange second life. At first, the buildings remained. Doors still stood. Tables still sat inside cottages. Cooking pots remained beside fireplaces. A traveler passing through might find a place that looked almost inhabited. Almost, but not quite. The silence would have been unsettling. No children running. No animals being tended. No smoke. No church bells. Just empty houses waiting for people who would never return. For a while, neighboring villagers sometimes salvaged useful items. Wood was valuable. Iron was valuable. Everything was valuable. Medieval people rarely wasted resources. If an abandoned village contained usable beams, doors, nails, carts, or tools, someone would eventually claim them. Quite often, entire buildings were dismantled piece by piece. A cottage could effectively migrate to another village without ever technically moving. Its components simply traveled separately. The process could take years, sometimes decades. Nature then began its slow work. And nature is patient. Grass pushed through pathways. Weeds appeared inside homes. Rain entered roofs. Wood rotted. Walls weakened. Animals moved in. Foxes explored abandoned cottages. Owls nested inside church towers. Mice inherited entire neighborhoods, which was perhaps the most successful property acquisition in medieval history. The fields suffered as well. Medieval farmland required constant labor. Without people, fields quickly changed. Plowed land became rough. Pastures grew wild. Hedges expanded. Trees returned. Within a generation, cultivated landscapes could become forests again. Travelers occasionally stumbled across these forgotten settlements. Sometimes all that remained was a church surrounded by empty land. Sometimes only low earthworks marked former streets. Sometimes there was almost nothing left at all, just faint bumps in the soil, the ghostly fingerprints of a vanished community. One of the most fascinating things about abandoned villages is how quickly memory disappeared. A settlement could exist for centuries. Hundreds of people might live there. Thousands might pass through over generations. Then, within 100 years, nobody remembered much about it. Names faded. Stories vanished. Families disappeared. A place that had once been someone's entire world became a footnote. Or less than a footnote. Merely a field. This happened more often than many people realize. Historians estimate that thousands of medieval villages vanished across Europe. England alone contains hundreds of what archaeologists call deserted medieval villages. The phrase sounds strangely formal, almost elegant, as if the villages politely excused themselves and left. In reality, the process was usually messy and often tragic. Not every village disappeared because of plague. Sometimes economics did the job. During the late medieval period, wool became extremely profitable. Landowners discovered that sheep could generate impressive income. Sheep, unlike peasants, rarely complained about taxes. They also tended not to organize rebellions. From a landlord's perspective, sheep possessed several attractive qualities. As wool prices rose, Some landowners evicted entire communities. Villages were demolished. Fields became grazing land. Families were forced elsewhere. Imagine living in a village where your grandparents were born, where generations of your family worked the same land. Then one day, a nobleman decides that sheep are more profitable than humans. And that's essentially the end of your village. The sheep probably never appreciated the significance of this transition. They simply continued being sheep, chewing grass, staring vaguely into the distance, accidentally becoming participants in economic history. Some abandoned villages resulted from environmental disasters. Rivers changed course, coastlines shifted, floods destroyed farmland, sand dunes swallowed settlements. Entire communities occasionally lost battles against geography itself. Nature, once again, proved remarkably indifferent to human plans. One particularly strange example occurred along parts of Europe's coastline where villages gradually disappeared beneath advancing sands. Imagine waking each year to discover slightly more of your world buried, a little more field gone, a little more road vanished, until eventually relocation becomes the only sensible option. Even by medieval standards, that would have been inconvenient. Then there were wars. Medieval warfare often harmed civilians far more than soldiers. Armies required food. Armies required supplies. Armies required places to sleep. And armies frequently acquired these necessities by taking them. Villages caught between rival forces suffered terribly. Fields burned. Homes burned. Sometimes everything burned. Military strategy occasionally resembled an argument settled by setting entire regions on fire. After repeated attacks, some villages never recovered. Survivors moved elsewhere. Buildings collapsed. The settlement slowly disappeared. Yet, even after abandonment, traces remained. And this is where our story becomes surprisingly peaceful, because abandoned villages never truly vanished. Not completely. The outlines lingered. Roads left scars in the landscape. House foundations survived underground. Churchyards preserved names. Centuries later, archaeologists arrived. They examined soil. They studied documents. They mapped earthworks. And gradually, they reconstructed forgotten lives. A depression in the ground might reveal an old cottage. A broken pot might reveal trade connections. Animal bones might reveal diet. Tiny fragments of ordinary life survived. History often celebrates kings and queens, but abandoned villages preserve something rarer: the lives of ordinary people. The farmer who owned 3 chickens, the widow who baked bread, the child who dropped a toy into the dirt and never found it again. Small details, quiet details, the kinds of lives that usually disappear from history, yet somehow they remain, hidden beneath fields, waiting patiently as the centuries pass. By the 18th and 19th centuries, many abandoned medieval villages looked completely natural. Travelers crossed them without noticing. Farmers plowed over them. Trees grew where houses once stood. Only careful observation revealed the truth. A strangely rectangular mound, an unusual pattern in the grass, a curve in the landscape that shouldn't exist. Ghosts, not of people, but of communities. And perhaps that's the most fascinating part. When everyone died or left, the village did not vanish overnight. It entered a long, slow transformation. Human order gave way to nature. Noise gave way to silence. Memory gave way to mystery. Yet traces endured. The medieval villagers could never have imagined. Archaeologists studying their rubbish centuries later. They could never have imagined satellite imagery revealing their lost streets. They certainly could not have imagined millions of people listening to bedtime history videos about them while lying comfortably in modern homes. History has a peculiar sense of humor, and as we slowly leave these abandoned villages behind, the evening air grows quiet once more. The cottages have collapsed. The roads have faded. The last villagers are long gone. Only the landscape remains, calm, silent, patient, holding its secrets beneath the grass, and waiting for us to continue our wandering journey through the strange and sleepy corners of the medieval world. Part 2. What was it like to be the last person left in a dying kingdom? As our walk through the abandoned villages fades into the darkness, let's drift somewhere larger. A place with walls, a place with banners, a place with kings, officials, tax collectors, and all the machinery that medieval rulers insisted was absolutely necessary. Tonight, we're going to imagine something rather unusual. What was it like to be the last person left in a dying kingdom? Not necessarily the last human being. That would be considerably more dramatic and frankly a little exhausting. Instead, imagine being among the final loyal subjects of a kingdom that is quietly disappearing around you. The maps still show its borders. The king still claims his titles. The officials still stamp documents. But everyone can feel it. The kingdom is dying, and no one quite knows what comes next. Let's begin on a chilly autumn evening. The year is somewhere in the late Middle Ages. The exact date hardly matters. History provides many examples. Kingdoms rose. Kingdoms flourished. Kingdoms collapsed, often with surprising speed. One generation could inherit a powerful realm. The next could inherit debt, empty castles, and several angry neighbors. Because, as it turns out, maintaining a kingdom is difficult. Medieval rulers frequently treated government like a family business run by cousins who barely tolerated one another. This produced predictable results. Imagine a small border kingdom. For centuries, it existed comfortably between larger powers. Not rich, not famous, but stable. Its towns traded goods. Its farms produced food. Its nobles occasionally argued over inheritance, which was practically a national pastime. Then trouble arrived. Not all at once. That would have been easier to understand. Instead, it came gradually. A failed harvest, then another, a disease outbreak, a succession dispute, a war that lasted longer than expected. Naturally, somebody increased taxes because medieval governments possessed an almost supernatural confidence that taxes could solve problems created by taxes. People began leaving. At first, only a few. A merchant moved to a larger city. A blacksmith crossed the border. A farming family packed their belongings and sought better opportunities elsewhere. The departures seemed temporary. Nobody worried. Yet every year, more people vanished. Shops closed. Houses stood empty. Fields went unworked. The kingdom grew quieter. If you were one of the people who stayed, you would notice small changes first. The market became smaller. Fewer voices. Fewer wagons. Fewer travelers. The familiar baker disappeared. The innkeeper left. The priest suddenly served 3 villages instead of 1. Every departure made the next departure easier. Soon entire neighborhoods stood abandoned. Doors swung in the wind. Garden walls crumbled. Cats inherited ownership of numerous properties, and unlike many medieval landlords, the cats demanded very little rent. The royal court felt the decline too. Kings often lived inside elaborate worlds of ceremony. But even the most sheltered monarch eventually noticed when half his tax revenue vanished. The treasury grew emptier. The army shrank. Officials went unpaid. This rarely improved morale. Imagine being a clerk in such a kingdom. Every morning you arrive at an office that once handled hundreds of petitions. Now only a handful remain. The same dusty documents sit on the same shelves. The same corridors echo with footsteps. Yet the building feels too large, too empty, like a theater after the audience has gone home. The kingdom still exists, technically, but it feels more like a memory than a country. History contains many examples of this slow fading. Some kingdoms were absorbed by neighbors, others fragmented into smaller states. Others simply lost importance until nobody outside their borders paid much attention. One of the strangest aspects of decline is that daily life often continues. People still marry, children still play, farmers still complain about weather. Life carries on even as institutions crumble. Imagine being an elderly villager watching the process unfold. You remember crowded markets. You remember festivals. You remember years when caravans filled the roads. Young people ask whether those stories are true, because the world they know looks entirely different. To them, the kingdom has always felt small, always felt fragile, always felt tired. The past sounds almost mythical. This happens surprisingly often in history. Great declines rarely feel dramatic while they are happening. Instead, they feel ordinary, slow, administrative, a series of small disappointments spread across decades. The kingdom loses one town, then another. One noble family departs, then another. One fortress closes, then another. No single event seems fatal, yet together they slowly drain away the future. Let's drift toward the royal palace. The king is growing older. His hair is thinner. His treasury is smaller. His list of problems is considerably longer. Officially, he remains powerful. Officially, he retains every title. Officially, the kingdom is flourishing. Royal proclamations tend to be optimistic. Reality, however, remains stubborn. The banquet hall that once hosted hundreds now hosts dozens. Servants quietly disappear. Entire wings of the palace stand unused. Tapestries gather dust. Courtyards grow silent. The palace becomes a monument to better days. Many rulers responded poorly to this situation. Some doubled taxes. Some launched wars. Some blamed advisors. Some blamed foreigners. Some blamed nearly everyone except themselves. History repeatedly demonstrates that powerful people rarely enjoy admitting mistakes. One ruler might spend enormous sums constructing a magnificent palace while villages emptied around him. Another might obsess over ceremonial titles while neighboring kingdoms prepared annexation plans. Human nature changes surprisingly little. Give someone a crown, and they remain perfectly capable of making questionable decisions, perhaps especially capable. Now imagine being one of the final soldiers loyal to such a kingdom. Your uniform is worn. Your pay arrives late. Sometimes it does not arrive at all. The fortress walls need repairs. The armory contains equipment older than your grandfather. Yet every morning you perform your duties. You patrol. You stand watch. You salute the flag. Not because victory seems likely, but because routine survives longer than optimism. There is something strangely moving about people who continue doing their jobs as systems collapse. Around them, teachers, clerks, soldiers, priests, they become caretakers of a fading world, a world they know may not survive. Eventually, neighboring powers notice weakness. They always do. History is full of ambitious rulers staring thoughtfully at maps. A declining kingdom looks tempting. Its defenses weaken. Its alliances crumble. Its treasury empties. Soon diplomats arrive, then demands, then negotiations, and sometimes armies. Not every dying kingdom ends in conquest. Some disappear through marriage. A princess marries a foreign prince. A royal line ends. Titles merge. Borders change. The kingdom vanishes quietly into another state. Centuries of independent history reduced to a signature on a document. Bureaucracy can be surprisingly effective at ending nations. Imagine being alive during that final transition. One day you are a subject of one kingdom. The next day you belong to another. Your village remains unchanged. Your house remains unchanged. Your sheep remain unchanged. The sheep, as usual, remain entirely unconcerned by geopolitical developments. Yet history has shifted beneath your feet. Flags change, laws change, taxes change. The tax collectors, unfortunately, never seem to disappear. If you happen to be among the final generation raised in the Old Kingdom, you would carry memories that younger people lacked. You would remember old rulers, old customs, old borders, stories that no longer matched political reality. Gradually, those memories would fade. Children would grow up under new governments. The Old Kingdom would become a chapter in a book, then a footnote, then perhaps nothing at all. And yet traces would remain. Place names, ruined castles, ancient coins buried in fields, forgotten royal tombs hidden beneath church floors. The landscape remembers long after people forget. Perhaps that is why historians find dying kingdoms so fascinating, not because of their destruction, but because of their final moments. The quiet years, the fading years, the years when ordinary people continued living their lives while history quietly packed its bags and prepared to leave. If you had been the last loyal subject in a dying kingdom, your experience would probably not resemble a grand tragedy. There would be no dramatic music, no final speeches, no heroic last stand atop a windswept hill. Instead, there would be ordinary mornings, ordinary evenings, a growing sense that the world of your childhood was slipping away, a sense that familiar things were becoming memories. And then one day you would realize something strange. The kingdom was gone, but life continued. The sun still rose. The fields still needed planting. The cows still escaped fences. And somewhere, inevitably, a tax collector still appeared. Some traditions, it seems, are immortal. As the night grows quieter, let's leave our fading kingdom behind. Its banners are lowering. Its castles are dark. Its rulers are names in old chronicles. Yet for a little while longer, the roads remain. The villages remain. And the last few loyal souls continue walking through a world that is slowly becoming history. Part 3. What did ancient people do when they couldn't sleep? As the last lights fade from our dying kingdom, let's continue our slow journey through the sleeping past. The castles have gone quiet. The roads are empty. The banners hang motionless in the night air. And somewhere, far away, a tired farmer is staring at the ceiling. Because tonight we're exploring a surprisingly universal problem. What did ancient people do when they couldn't sleep? It's a comforting thought, in a way. Thousands of years ago, long before smartphones, television, alarm clocks, or late night internet rabbit holes about medieval footwear, people were lying awake in the darkness, wondering why their brains had suddenly decided that now was the perfect time to become active. Humanity has changed many things. Insomnia is not one of them. Let's drift back to ancient Egypt. The air is warm. The Nile moves quietly through the darkness. Most homes have gone silent. Oil lamps flicker softly. Families sleep on woven mats or simple beds. At least they try to. Ancient Egyptians, like us, occasionally found themselves awake in the middle of the night. The difference was that they lacked modern explanations. No sleep studies, no neuroscience, no helpful articles explaining why drinking 6 cups of coffee before sunset might be a questionable decision. Instead, many Egyptians viewed sleep as something closely connected to the spiritual world. Dreams mattered. Dreams carried messages. Dreams sometimes contained warnings, and occasionally they contained advice, which was convenient. Imagine waking at midnight in ancient Egypt. You might assume a god was trying to tell you something. This sounds impressive. It also sounds slightly stressful. Modern insomnia is frustrating. Ancient insomnia occasionally came with divine paperwork attached. Egyptians sometimes wrote prayers requesting peaceful sleep. Others sought protection from nightmares. Amulets were placed near beds. Protective symbols decorated sleeping spaces. The hope was simple: a quiet night, a pleasant dream, and perhaps fewer supernatural complications. Across the ancient world, sleep occupied a strange territory, part biology, part mystery, part religion. Nobody fully understood what happened when consciousness disappeared. Naturally, humans filled the gaps with stories. The Greeks had plenty of stories. They generally had stories for everything. If somebody sneezed unusually in ancient Greece, there was probably already a myth explaining it. The Greeks imagined sleep as a divine force. The god of sleep, known as Hypnos, occupied an important place in mythology. According to legend, he lived in a dark and peaceful cave where sunlight never entered. Streams flowed quietly nearby. Poppies grew around the entrance. Everything was designed to encourage drowsiness. Frankly, it sounds considerably more relaxing than many modern apartments. For ordinary Greeks struggling to sleep, nighttime often became a period of reflection. Artificial light remained limited. The world grew genuinely dark after sunset. Without bright screens and electric lamps, people experienced darkness in a way that modern humans rarely do. The stars dominated the sky. The landscape faded into shadows. The night felt enormous. Someone lying awake might listen to distant animals. They might pray. They might think about family problems, financial worries, upcoming harvests, embarrassing conversations from 3 years ago. Human minds have always been remarkably talented at revisiting awkward memories at inconvenient hours. The Romans inherited many Greek ideas about sleep. Then, being Romans, they attempted to organize them. Romans enjoyed organizing things: roads, laws, governments, military campaigns, occasionally entire continents. When Romans couldn't sleep, many turned toward practical remedies. Some physicians recommended dietary changes. Others suggested baths, exercise, herbal mixtures. Various medical theories flourished. Not all were particularly effective. Ancient medicine frequently involved confidence exceeding evidence. One Roman doctor might recommend warm wine. Another might recommend cold water. A third might suggest something involving herbs, oils, and reasoning that becomes increasingly difficult to follow. Yet, despite their limitations, many ancient physicians recognized an important truth. Stress affects sleep. An anxious person often struggles to rest. A peaceful person generally sleeps better. Simple observations. Still true today. Now let's drift farther east. Ancient China developed sophisticated ideas about sleep and health long before many other regions. Traditional medical texts discussed balance within the body. Sleep formed an important part of maintaining harmony. A restless night suggested something was out of balance. Perhaps diet, perhaps emotions, perhaps lifestyle. Ancient Chinese scholars often treated nighttime wakefulness as an opportunity for quiet reflection. Many spent long hours reading, writing poetry, or contemplating philosophy. Imagine a sleepless scholar sitting beside an oil lamp. Outside, the world remains silent. Inside, a brush moves slowly across paper. A poem emerges. A thought develops. An idea survives for centuries. Not a bad use of insomnia, all things considered. Of course, most people weren't writing poetry. Most people were farmers. Farmers generally preferred sleeping. They had work in the morning, very early work, the kind of work that begins before birds fully commit to being awake. Agricultural societies depended heavily upon daylight. People rose with the sun. They rested after dark. Yet historians have discovered something fascinating. Many pre-industrial societies may not have slept exactly as we do. Evidence suggests that some populations practiced what historians call segmented sleep. Instead of one continuous block of sleep, people often slept in two portions. They experienced a first sleep. Then they woke for a period during the night. Then they returned for a second sleep. This nighttime waking wasn't necessarily considered unusual. People prayed, talked quietly, checked animals, added wood to fires, or simply sat awake for a while. Then they returned to bed. Imagine discovering that your midnight wakefulness wasn't a problem. It was simply part of the schedule. Many modern insomniacs might find that reassuring, though perhaps less reassuring if accompanied by medieval livestock demanding attention. At 3 in the morning, let's move briefly into Northern Europe. The winters here are long. The nights are longer. Darkness settles across villages for hours upon hours. In these conditions, nighttime became a world of stories. Families gathered around fires. They shared legends, songs, local gossip, warnings about mysterious creatures lurking beyond the village boundaries. Because every culture eventually invents something unpleasant living in nearby forests. It's practically mandatory for people unable to sleep. These long evenings often blended into storytelling sessions. Someone remained awake to tend the fire. Someone told another tale. The hours passed slowly. Darkness became something shared rather than endured alone. One thing ancient people generally lacked was our modern obsession with efficiency. If they woke during the night, they did not immediately calculate how many hours of sleep remained. They did not stare anxiously at glowing clocks. They did not panic because tomorrow might feel difficult. The concept existed, of course. People understood exhaustion, but the constant awareness of time was different. Many simply accepted wakefulness when it arrived. They waited. Eventually, sleep returned, or morning arrived, whichever came first. There is something surprisingly calming about that attitude, a certain patience, a recognition that not every problem requires immediate solving. Sometimes the night simply unfolds at its own pace. Ancient rulers experienced sleeplessness too. Kings worried, queens worried, emperors worried. Power rarely improves sleep quality. If anything, it creates entirely new categories of concern. Imagine being a Roman emperor lying awake at midnight. You control vast territories, millions of subjects, legions of soldiers, and yet your brain chooses this exact moment to replay an awkward conversation from a diplomatic banquet. History can be wonderfully equalizing. Whether peasant or emperor, everyone eventually finds themselves staring into the darkness, wondering why they are still awake. As our journey through the ancient night continues, one thing becomes clear. People have always struggled with sleep. They have prayed for it, written about it, studied it, complained about it, and occasionally surrendered to it with great relief. The details changed. The centuries changed. The civilizations changed. Yet the experience remained familiar. A quiet room, a dark sky, a restless mind, and the hope that sleep would arrive soon. Eventually, for most people, it did. The oil lamps burned lower. The fires softened into glowing embers. The villages grew silent. The temples grew silent. The cities grew silent. And one by one, ancient people drifted into dreams, leaving us alone beneath the stars for just a little longer. As the night deepens around us, let's allow the darkness to settle once again. The Nile grows quiet. The Roman roads fade into shadow. The scholar extinguishes his lamp, and somewhere in the distance, another sleepy corner of history waits patiently for our arrival. Part 4. What was it like to be the most hated person in a medieval town? As the ancient world slowly drifts into sleep, let's continue our quiet wander through history. The lamps have gone out. The scholars have finished their writing. The farmers have finally stopped worrying about tomorrow's weather. And now we're arriving somewhere much smaller. A medieval town, not a grand capital, not a royal palace, just a crowded collection of houses, workshops, market stalls, muddy streets, suspicious chickens, and people who knew entirely too much about one another. Because tonight we're exploring a rather uncomfortable question. What was it like to be the most hated person in a medieval town? Not the most dangerous, not the most powerful, not even the most criminal. Simply the person everybody disliked, which, in a medieval town, could become a surprisingly serious position. Unlike modern cities, medieval towns offered very little anonymity. Everyone knew everyone. Everyone knew where everyone lived. Everyone knew who owed money. Everyone knew whose cow wandered into whose garden. And everyone definitely knew who was causing trouble. A typical medieval town might contain only a few thousand residents. Some contained far fewer. The result was a world where reputation mattered enormously. You could not simply reinvent yourself. You could not quietly disappear into another neighborhood. If you embarrassed yourself publicly, the memory could survive for decades, possibly generations. Medieval communities treated gossip as both entertainment and infrastructure. Information traveled remarkably fast. Privacy traveled considerably slower. Imagine waking one morning and realizing that almost everybody in town dislikes you. Perhaps you cheated customers. Perhaps you lied repeatedly. Perhaps you betrayed a local trust. Perhaps you were simply rude for long enough that collective patience finally expired. Whatever the cause, your reputation has collapsed. The baker frowns when you enter. The butcher suddenly becomes busy. Neighbors stop conversations when you approach. Children point. People whisper. The atmosphere changes. And in a world built upon personal relationships, that change matters. Very few medieval people lived independently. Most relied heavily upon neighbors, borrowing tools, sharing labor, trading favors, helping during harvests, assisting during emergencies. Community wasn't optional. It was survival, which meant social exclusion carried real consequences. Today, being unpopular can certainly be unpleasant. In a medieval town, it could threaten your livelihood. Let's imagine one particularly unfortunate resident. We'll call him Martin. Not because all Martins cause trouble. History has enough problems without starting arguments with modern Martins. Our Martin owns a small workshop. For years, he has developed a reputation for dishonesty. He cuts corners. He overcharges. He blames customers for mistakes. He insults competitors. And somehow he remains surprised when people stop liking him. History contains many examples of individuals confidently creating their own problems. Martin would fit comfortably into that tradition. At first, townspeople merely complain. Then they avoid his business. Then they actively warn others. Soon his reputation spreads beyond the town itself. Traveling merchants hear stories. Visitors hear stories. Even neighboring villages hear stories. The medieval rumor network operates with remarkable efficiency. In some ways, it functioned faster than official communication. People enjoy sharing warnings, especially warnings involving someone else's bad decisions. Now imagine attending church every week while everyone dislikes you. Medieval society revolved around communal gatherings, markets, festivals, religious services, public celebrations. There were very few places to hide. You would constantly encounter the same faces, the same disapproving looks, the same awkward silences. And because medieval life emphasized collective identity, standing apart felt especially uncomfortable. Human beings generally prefer belonging. Being excluded hurts. It hurt then. It hurts now. The difference is that medieval communities offered fewer escape routes. Sometimes the most hated person wasn't a dishonest merchant. Sometimes it was an unpopular official. Tax collectors occupied this category with impressive consistency. Few professions have achieved such remarkable historical continuity. Across centuries and continents, tax collectors repeatedly discovered that people preferred keeping their money. A shocking revelation. Imagine serving as the local tax officer. You arrive carrying official authority. You also arrive carrying demands for payment. Neither quality tends to inspire affection. Every poor harvest becomes your problem. Every financial hardship becomes your problem. Every complaint eventually becomes your problem. You may be entirely honest, entirely competent, entirely innocent, yet nobody is excited to see you. In fairness, some tax collectors earned their reputations. Corruption existed. Abuse existed. Extortion existed. Power occasionally attracted exactly the wrong personalities. Medieval governments, much like modern governments, were not always perfect at employee screening. Then there were informers. Few figures inspired more suspicion than individuals accused of secretly reporting neighbors to authorities. Trust mattered deeply in small communities. Once people suspected betrayal, relationships could unravel rapidly. Whether accusations were true or false often mattered less than perception. Reputation, once damaged, proved difficult to repair. Let's drift toward another unfortunate category: the outsider. Medieval towns frequently viewed strangers with caution. Most residents spent their entire lives near their birthplace. Someone arriving from far away immediately attracted attention. Different accent, different customs, different habits. Curiosity mixed easily with suspicion. Most outsiders integrated successfully. Some did not. During difficult times, communities occasionally sought convenient targets for frustration. History contains many examples of vulnerable individuals becoming scapegoats during crises, poor harvests, disease outbreaks, economic hardships. Fear encouraged blame, and blame often searched for easy destinations. The results could be deeply unfair. Human nature, unfortunately, has not entirely abandoned this habit. One of the strangest aspects of medieval hatred is how often it emerged from surprisingly small disputes. A disagreement over property, an inheritance conflict, a business rivalry, an argument that began with chickens and somehow escalated into decades of resentment. People remain remarkably creative when sustaining grudges. Medieval records occasionally preserve feuds, so petty that modern historians struggle not to smile. Entire families spent generations arguing over issues nobody fully remembered. The original cause vanished. The hostility remained. It's almost impressive. Imagine inheriting a grudge from your grandfather without understanding why it exists. Yet such things happened regularly. Being hated also carried practical dangers. Legal systems existed, certainly, but daily justice often depended upon community cooperation. Witnesses mattered, character mattered, reputation mattered. A respected individual enjoyed advantages. A disliked individual faced obstacles. Fairly or unfairly, social standing influenced outcomes. This created powerful incentives for maintaining good relationships, or at least avoiding public feuds involving livestock. Yet not every hated person deserved sympathy. Some genuinely behaved terribly. Bullies existed. Fraudsters existed. Violent troublemakers existed. Every medieval town contained individuals who repeatedly tested communal patience. When chronic troublemakers found themselves isolated, neighbors often felt little regret. Actions had consequences, even in the Middle Ages, perhaps especially in the Middle Ages. Now let's consider something quieter: loneliness. Being disliked wasn't merely a public experience, it was personal. The medieval world could be harsh. Life expectancy remained uncertain. Disease remained common. Accidents remained frequent. In difficult times, people depended upon social networks, friends, relatives, neighbors. To lose those connections could feel devastating. Imagine attending festivals alone, working alone, eating alone, watching everyone else share conversations while you remain excluded. The emotional weight would be familiar to modern people. Technology changes. Human feelings rarely do. Interestingly, some hated individuals eventually repaired their reputations. Communities could forgive, especially when genuine change occurred. A dishonest merchant who became honest, a quarrelsome neighbor who made peace, a troublesome citizen who matured. Redemption existed, not always, but often enough. Medieval society could be surprisingly practical. People preferred cooperation when possible. Endless conflict exhausted everyone. Even professional grudge holders occasionally needed a day off. As the years passed, many former villains quietly reintegrated into town life. Others left entirely, starting over somewhere new. A fresh town, a fresh reputation, and hopefully fewer arguments involving chickens. So, what was it really like to be the most hated person in a medieval town? It was probably less dramatic than stories suggest. No angry mobs every morning, no constant confrontations. Instead, something slower, colder, more persistent. The weight of disapproval, the absence of trust, the feeling that every interaction carried a shadow. In a world built upon community, losing community hurt. Perhaps that is why medieval people cared so deeply about reputation, not simply because they valued honor, but because belonging mattered. A good reputation opened doors, a bad reputation closed them, and every person understood the difference. As evening settles over our medieval town, the market stalls close. The blacksmith extinguishes his forge. The church bell rings softly through the darkness. Windows glow with candlelight. Families gather indoors. Conversations fade. And somewhere along a quiet street, the town's least popular resident walks home alone. Not a monster, not a legend, just another flawed human being, navigating the complicated business of living among other people. A challenge that history suggests has never been entirely simple. The town grows quieter. The candles burn lower. The muddy streets empty beneath the moon. And together we'll continue wandering deeper into the strange, sleepy corners of the past. Part 5. What did ancient people do when they had no friends? As the lights of our medieval town slowly disappear behind us, let's continue our gentle journey into another quiet corner of human history. The market stalls have closed. The church bells have fallen silent. The last footsteps have faded into the darkness. And somewhere, beneath a sky filled with stars, a lonely person sits awake. Not a king, not a famous general, not a legendary hero, just an ordinary human being. Because tonight we're exploring something surprisingly timeless. What did ancient people do when they had no friends? It sounds like a modern question, the kind of thing someone might type into a search engine at 2 in the morning while staring thoughtfully at the ceiling. But loneliness is far older than the internet, far older than cities, far older than written history itself. Human beings have probably felt lonely for as long as human beings have existed, which means that somewhere around a campfire 40,000 years ago, one unfortunate hunter was almost, certainly wondering why nobody seemed interested in talking to him. Some problems never truly disappear. Let's begin in the ancient world. When we imagine ancient civilizations, we often picture crowded cities, busy markets, grand temples, festivals, parades, huge gatherings of people, and those things certainly existed. Yet being surrounded by people is not the same as feeling connected to them. Ancient writers understood this surprisingly well. Many left behind reflections on isolation that sound remarkably modern. Imagine living in ancient Athens. The city bustles with activity. Philosophers debate in public squares. Merchants shout from crowded stalls. Politicians argue loudly about matters of state, which, to be fair, politicians have continued doing ever since. The city is full of life, yet you feel disconnected from it. Perhaps your family has died. Perhaps you've moved from another region. Perhaps you simply struggle to fit into the social circles around you. Ancient people rarely used the word loneliness in exactly the way we do today, but they absolutely recognized the feeling. The Greeks often discussed friendship as one of life's most important gifts. The philosopher Aristotle wrote extensively about friendship. In fact, he considered it essential for a good life. Without meaningful relationships, something important was missing. This wasn't merely sentimental thinking. It reflected everyday reality. Ancient societies depended heavily upon social networks. Friends provided support, advice, protection, opportunities, companionship. Without those connections, life became much harder. Imagine a young craftsman arriving in a large city. He knows nobody, no relatives, no close companions, no trusted allies. Every conversation feels uncertain. Every face is unfamiliar. Every gathering reminds him that everyone else seems to belong somewhere. The experience would feel familiar to many modern people. Some emotions travel remarkably well across centuries. So, what did ancient people actually do? Often, they sought community wherever they could find it. Religious groups became important. Temples provided more than spiritual guidance. They created social connections, shared rituals, shared meals, shared responsibilities. Someone without close personal friends might still find belonging within a religious community. Across the ancient Mediterranean, countless people built friendships through shared worship, not because they were necessarily searching for friendship, but because humans naturally form connections while doing things together. The Romans understood this too. Roman society revolved around networks, families, patrons, clients, guilds, military units, neighborhood associations. People belonged to groups, lots of groups. A Roman with few personal friends might join a professional organization, attend public events, participate in local religious festivals. Roman life provided many opportunities to encounter others. Some encounters remained superficial. Others developed into genuine friendships. Even 2,000 years ago, relationships often began with repeated accidental meetings. One thing ancient people did not generally do was sit alone scrolling endlessly through bad news, mostly because the technology had not yet been invented. Their loneliness unfolded differently. When alone, many turned toward work. A farmer worked, a potter worked, a merchant worked. Labor filled time. Sometimes it also created social connections. Shared work often produced shared experiences, and shared experiences frequently became friendships. Not always, but often enough. Let's drift eastward for a moment. In ancient China, scholars frequently wrote about solitude. Interestingly, they distinguished between loneliness and chosen isolation. The two were not necessarily the same. Some individuals deliberately sought quiet lives. They retreated into nature. They read. They wrote poetry. They reflected upon philosophy. They found satisfaction in solitude. Loneliness, however, was something different. Loneliness involved absence, a gap where connection should be. Ancient Chinese literature contains many beautiful passages describing people separated from loved ones, travelers far from home, officials assigned to distant provinces, students studying away from family. The emotions remain recognizable even today. A person standing beside a river, looking toward a distant horizon, thinking about people they miss. History changes. Human hearts remain surprisingly consistent. Now let's visit a monastery. At first glance, monks might appear to be lonely. After all, many lived apart from ordinary society. Yet most monasteries functioned as communities. People prayed together, worked together, ate together, shared routines. Even silence became something collective. The experience differed greatly from isolation. In fact, many monks spent their entire lives surrounded by familiar faces. Just quieter faces, much quieter. Imagine spending decades with people who communicate primarily through prayer and occasional nodding. Some personalities would thrive. Others might desperately miss small talk. Ancient friendships often formed through necessity. Travel presented dangers. Work required cooperation. Survival encouraged teamwork. Many friendships grew from practical circumstances. Two merchants traveling together. Two soldiers serving together. Two laborers sharing responsibilities. Repeated interaction created trust. Trust created friendship, sometimes very deep. Friendship. Ancient letters reveal bonds that lasted decades. People worried about absent friends, missed them, grieved them, celebrated reunions. The emotional language feels strikingly familiar. One Roman writer complained about separation from friends in terms that sound remarkably modern. Apparently, missing people is not a recent invention. Now imagine someone who truly has no close companions, no family nearby, no trusted confidants, no meaningful social circle. What might they do? Many ancient people turned towards storytelling. Stories offered companionship of a sort. Epic poems, legends, religious texts, oral traditions. Listening to stories connected individuals to larger communities, to shared histories, to shared identities. A lonely evening beside a fire felt less lonely when accompanied by familiar tales. Others turned toward animals. History rarely discusses this topic in detail, but people have always formed attachments to animals. Dogs, cats, horses, birds. Companionship does not always require conversation, though some cats seem convinced they are. Participating in very important conversations. Ancient households often included animals that became beloved companions. A lonely person could find comfort in their presence. The relationship may not replace human friendship, but it certainly helped. The ancient world also offered something modern life sometimes lacks: periods of communal gathering, seasonal festivals, religious celebrations, public ceremonies, harvest feasts. These events brought people together regularly. Someone living in relative isolation still encountered neighbors throughout the year. Communities created opportunities for connection, not perfect opportunities. Human relationships have never been perfect, but opportunities nonetheless. Of course, loneliness could still become painful. Ancient literature contains numerous examples. Poems about separation, letters about abandonment, stories about exile. Exile, in particular, terrified many ancient societies. Being expelled from one's community often meant losing everything familiar: home, friends, identity, purpose. The punishment felt severe precisely because belonging mattered so deeply. Humans are social creatures. Ancient people knew this without needing scientific studies. They observed it directly. People flourished together. People suffered alone. The pattern appeared again and again. Yet history also offers something encouraging. Loneliness was rarely permanent. Lives changed. Communities changed. Friendships appeared unexpectedly. A traveler arrived. A neighbor introduced themselves. A shared task created conversation. A conversation became trust. Trust became friendship. The process looked much the same then as it does now. Slowly, naturally, one small interaction at a time. As our journey continues through the ancient night, we discover that people thousands of years ago were not so different from us. They wanted companionship, understanding, belonging, someone to share stories with beside a fire, someone to greet them in the morning, someone who noticed when they were absent. The details of their world differed enormously. The emotions did not. And perhaps that realization feels comforting. Across thousands of years, countless lonely people looked up at the same stars, wondering whether they truly belonged, wondering whether they would find connection, wondering whether tomorrow might be different. Often it was, the fire burns lower now. The villages grow quiet. The Roman roads disappear into darkness. The scholar closes his book. The traveler settles beside the campfire. And somewhere in the distance, another forgotten life from history waits patiently for us to discover it. For now, though, the night remains peaceful. The stars remain bright, and our slow walk through the sleeping past continues onward.